Visualize the setting. July 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The architects of the global economy are toasting the dawn of what they naively believe is a new era of enduring prosperity. These delegates applaud their own genius, convinced they have engineered a flawless monetary system, destined to usher in stability and growth for a world ravaged by war. Yet, amidst this self-congratulation, a lone French economist, Jacques Rueff, perceives a dark truth, hidden within the system's mathematical architecture. While others are celebrating, Rueff is already dissecting a fatal flaw, a poison pill embedded in its very foundation. The calculations he made that summer would echo with chilling prophecy over the subsequent 27 years. His dire warnings of the system's inevitable collapse were systematically dismissed, ignored, and even ridiculed, until the day his predictions materialized with terrifying mathematical precision. And this is the critical point that demands your immediate attention. America was given an 80-year advance warning of the very monetary crisis we face today. The exact same fundamental flaws that Rueff identified back in 1944 are now screaming for our attention. And yet, we remain deaf to the alarm. The system celebrated by our leaders was built upon a catastrophic error, a structural time bomb. Under Bretton Woods, the United States was tasked with supplying the world with dollars as its primary reserve currency. This currency was to be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. It sounds stable, almost reassuring, doesn't it? But Rueff's analytical mind immediately pierced the veil, exposing the impossible mathematics at its core. For the global economy to possess sufficient dollars to facilitate international trade, the United States was forced to run a persistent balance of payments deficit. In essence, we had to spend more abroad than we earned, thereby pumping dollars into the world system. But this is the paradox, the chilling catch that Rueff foresaw. Those accumulating deficits would inevitably grow to dwarf our finite gold reserves. A tipping point was inevitable, a moment when foreign nations would possess more claims on our gold than the United States actually held. Consider the implications of this scenario. Imagine you promise to redeem all your IOUs for gold on demand. However, to keep the economy functioning, you are forced to issue far more IOUs than you have gold in your vault. What is the inevitable outcome when everyone arrives simultaneously to cash in? Rueff's analysis concluded this day of reckoning was not some remote possibility. It was a cold, hard, mathematical certainty. The system was designed to self-destruct. But in 1944, America, flush with victory and unparalleled economic power, was in no mood for such dire predictions. American officials arrogantly dismissed Rueff as a relic, another European gold bug clinging to an obsolete past. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau reportedly laughed outright when confronted with Rueff's analysis. The French, he condescendingly told his staff, are still thinking in the 19th century. This was not mere ignorance. It was a deliberate, willful blindness fueled by a potent strain of American exceptionalism. Our leadership operated under the delusion that America's economic supremacy could somehow suspend the fundamental laws of mathematics. They believed our dominance was so absolute that other nations would accumulate our dollars indefinitely, never daring to call our bluff and demand the gold we had pledged. Yet, by the early 1950s, the first tremors of Rueff's prophetic warnings were already being felt. The nation's balance of payments deficits were expanding precisely along the trajectory he had forecasted. Our gold reserves, which had crested at over 20,000 tons in 1949, commenced a slow but inexorable bleed. Federal Reserve data from the period confirms a chilling fact. We were hemorrhaging gold at the exact rate Rueff's cold calculations had predicted years earlier. But what elevates this story from a mere miscalculation to an infuriating tragedy is the persistent, deliberate refusal to heed the alarms. When Robert Triffin later formalized Rueff's insights in 1960, creating what is now known as the Triffin dilemma, and proved again, mathematically, that the system was fundamentally unsustainable, American officials dismissed him with the same arrogance. They labeled his work as mere theoretical economics, disconnected from the practical realities of the real world. All the while, Rueff continued to publish his analyses, sharpening his timeline for the inevitable collapse with each passing year. This was not the work of some vague doomsday prophet. Rueff was a clinician of catastrophe, providing specific, verifiable mathematical proofs that detailed precisely when and how the system was programmed to fail. Perhaps the most chilling element of his forecast was his prediction of America's response. When the crisis inevitably struck, our leaders would refuse to admit the system's foundational flaw. Instead, they would frame it as a temporary emergency, one that necessitated temporary measures. A solemn promise would be made to restore gold convertibility once conditions stabilized, all while knowing with absolute certainty that such a return was impossible. This saga transcends mere monetary policy. It's a stark examination of a nation's collision with mathematical reality. Rueff had provided a precise, analytical roadmap to our financial future, one that clearly marked all the warning signs, the points of no return, and even the available exit ramps. But America's leaders, intoxicated by the immense power that came with monetary dominance, chose to deliberately ignore the countdown clock that he had set in motion in 1944. Every single ton of gold that bled from Fort Knox was another tick of that inexorable timer. Each surge in our balance of payments deficit was another tick of the clock, counting down to an inescapable reckoning. The portents were unmistakable, blazing like crimson beacons for any who dared to look. Yet America had locked its course. We were committed to riding this tiger, regardless of the inevitable violent dismount. The consequences were a problem for another day. The subsequent events provide a chilling case study in how the American establishment confronts uncomfortable mathematical realities. Rather than heeding Rueff's meticulous warnings, our government initiated a calculated and systematic campaign to neutralize any voice that dared challenge the dollar's absolute supremacy. From 1958 through 1961, Jacques Rueff released a sequence of exhaustive economic analyses that read less like academic papers and more like a precise countdown to financial Armageddon. These were not ambiguous forecasts of some distant trouble. He was architecting specific, verifiable mathematical models that demonstrated precisely how and when the Bretton Woods system was fated to implode. According to his calculations, the fracture point was preordained. It would arrive the moment foreign dollar holdings outstripped America's gold reserves by a margin so vast that the bedrock of confidence would shatter. Data from the Bank for International Settlements during this era reveals Rueff's prophecies unfolding with chilling precision. U.S. gold reserves plummeted from 20,312 tons in 1957 down to a mere 17,804 tons by 1960. As foreign claims on the dollar surged beyond $18 billion. The cold, hard mathematics were materializing just as Rueff had foretold. Yet, in the face of this mounting, verifiable evidence, American officials did not reconsider. They instead perfected a standard protocol for the outright dismissal of these alarms. Every critique leveled against the dollar system was reflexively branded as the bitter envy of Europe or the archaic ramblings of gold standard nostalgists. Treasury officials methodically briefed the press, seeding the narrative that these foreign economists were simply incapable of grasping the sophisticated new paradigms of modern international finance. Then, the dynamic shifted. Charles de Gaulle chose to elevate Rueff's academic prophecies into the realm of official French state policy. In February of 1965, de Gaulle convened a press conference that sent seismic tremors through the corridors of Washington. Staring directly into the cameras, he announced that France would no longer tolerate what he termed the exorbitant privilege of America's unchecked monetary hegemony. He issued a stark demand for a return to the discipline of the gold standard, invoking the precise mathematical arguments that Rueff had been championing for more than a decade. Consider the sheer audacity of this act. The leader of America's most ancient ally was publicly denouncing its monetary framework as fundamentally inequitable and, critically, mathematically doomed to fail. De Gaulle was not merely engaging in policy critique. He was directly citing Jacques Rueff's specific, calculated predictions on the timing. America's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated dismissal. Secretary of State Dean Rusk informed reporters that France was mired in the past. But this is the infuriating core of. They were privately observing them materialize with the cold, hard certainty of a mathematical proof. Declassified Federal Reserve meeting minutes from that era reveal central bankers voicing grave concerns over the very structural flaws Rueff had pinpointed. And France was not merely posturing. They were acting decisively on Rueff's analysis. From 1963 to 1966, under Operation Vitus, France executed a systematic conversion of its dollar reserves into physical gold, repatriating a staggering 3,313 tons from American vaults. A contagion of doubt began to spread as other nations followed France's lead. Treasury Department records confirm that foreign redemptions of gold accelerated from $1.7 billion in 1964 to a troubling $3.2 billion by 1965. The alarm bells were now being rung even by our most steadfast allies. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan confidentially proposed to President Kennedy that America devalue the dollar to $70 per ounce of gold, a desperate bid to restore mathematical equilibrium to the teetering system. Kennedy dismissed the suggestion without a moment's hesitation, adamantly insisting that America's economic might rendered such drastic measures entirely superfluous. A chilling pattern was now undeniable. Each new warning was validated with greater accuracy than the one before. And yet, America's official response remained rigidly unchanged. Deny the problem, dismiss the critics, and double down on a system that was visibly failing. By 1968, the mathematical inevitability that Rueff had calculated as far back as 1944 was becoming impossible to ignore. The London Gold Pool, an entity specifically designed to artificially suppress gold prices and thus preserve confidence in the dollar's convertibility, was now hemorrhaging its gold reserves at a rate that was fundamentally unsustainable. In March of 1968, the pool finally collapsed, having bled out 1,000 tons of gold in a mere 3-month period. Bank of England ledgers reveal a final, frantic week where a surge of panic buying bled reserves dry at a rate that defied all projections. This was the precise moment ROF's theoretical timelines shattered and reformed into a real-time crisis. The discrete exchange of dollars for gold by foreign powers had ceased. It had become a frantic race to abandon the system before its inevitable implosion. Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands now joined France in a methodical hoarding of gold. Their actions engineered the very crisis of confidence that ROF's calculations had long ago established as a certainty. And yet, even as the London gold pool disintegrated and markets convulsed, American officials maintained a public facade, dismissing the events as mere temporary disruptions within a fundamentally stable framework. Treasury Secretary Henry Fowler declared the dollar's foundations unshakable, insisting convertibility was sacrosanct. The classified minutes of their meetings, however, narrate a starkly different reality. Behind closed doors, the very officials who publicly scorned ROF's predictions were privately scrambling, debating emergency protocols to stanch the hemorrhaging of gold. They understood the cold, unforgiving arithmetic. A public admission, however, would instantly detonate the very crisis of confidence they were desperately trying to diffuse. The tragic irony is that by 1969, America's own economists were finally arriving at the same stark conclusions ROF had published back in 1944. Robert Triffin's analysis at Yale was now demonstrating that the system was built upon internal contradictions, rendering its eventual collapse a mathematical certainty. But rather than acknowledging the French economists who had diagnosed these fatal flaws a quarter-century prior, American academic and policy circles hailed these insights as novel revelations. By 1970, the very warnings once brushed aside as simple European envy were solidifying into the consensus view among global monetary authorities. The entire framework was hurtling toward the precise breaking point that ROF had calculated with chilling accuracy. Foreign claims on the dollar now dwarfed American gold reserves by a ratio that rendered convertibility a logistical impossibility. For 30 years, America had systematically silenced every Cassandra. But the unyielding logic of mathematics is immune to public relations. The countdown clock that ROF had set in motion in 1944 was now ticking perilously close to zero, and no volume of denial could halt the inevitable. The scene: Camp David, Maryland, August 13th, 1971. President Nixon is seated, facing his economic council. He is staring at a set of figures that would have brought a grim, vindicated smile to Jacques Rueff's face. After 27 years of rejecting warnings of a mathematical impossibility, America was now confronting the exact endgame the French economist had forecasted with such unnerving precision. The data spread across the table narrated the final moments of a system in terminal decline. The nation's gold reserves had plummeted to a mere 10,000 tons. Meanwhile, foreign claims against that gold surpassed $40 billion, valued at the official $35 per ounce. The stark reality was that America owed more gold than was physically held in Fort Knox, the Federal Reserve, and all other U.S. repositories combined. This was no transient liquidity crunch, nor a crisis of confidence solvable with better messaging. This was the mathematical checkmate Jacques Rueff had laid out in 1944, now playing out on the world stage. It was unfolding precisely as his models foretold. The system's design necessitated that America supply dollars globally by running balance of payments deficits. Yet those very deficits had now catastrophically outgrown the nation's capacity to honor its promise of gold conversion. Paul Volcker, at the time the Undersecretary of the Treasury, would later concede what every single person in that room understood, but dared not utter in public. The French had been correct about the math all along. The very admonitions U.S. officials had waved away as European resentment for 3 decades stood exposed as precise mathematical prophecy. But what renders this moment truly staggering is its near-perfect alignment with Rueff's specific forecasts. His warning was not a vague premonition of future trouble. He had calculated the specific trigger point. A crisis would ignite when foreign dollar claims achieved a critical mass, making the promise of gold conversion transparently impossible. By August of 1971, that critical threshold had not only been reached, but decisively surpassed. It was Treasury Secretary John Connally who delivered the unvarnished truth to Nixon. We may never go back to it. Convertibility. I suspect we never will. The measure being contemplated was not a temporary emergency stopgap. It was the permanent repudiation of the foundational pledge America had made at Bretton Woods. The very system ROF had pronounced mathematically terminal in 1944 was, at last, conceding its own demise. And it is at this juncture that the narrative takes an infuriating turn. Even as the Nixon administration prepared to detonate the very crisis Rueff had foretold, they were already constructing the narrative, a calculated deception designed to mask the truth, precisely as the French economist had predicted. Rather than confronting the system's terminal diagnosis, they would deploy a carefully crafted fiction, a temporary measure against speculators, with a hollow promise to restore order. And so, on the fateful evening of August 15th, 1971, the charade began. Nixon delivered a national address that was a chilling echo of Rueff's script, announcing the so-called temporary severing of the dollar from its golden anchor. He cast blame on shadowy foreign speculators for manufacturing the crisis, all while pledging America's commitment to a stability it had just single-handedly obliterated. Every component of this public performance aligned perfectly with Rueff's grim forecast. The official story would be one of a sound system, ambushed by external aggressors. A false hope would be offered, a return to the old order, dangled just out of reach until some undefined improvement materialized. And the core truth, that the underlying mathematics were always unsustainable, would remain buried. The global fallout that followed was a stark testament to the terrifying precision of Rueff's analysis. The shock among European finance ministers was not directed at the event itself, an outcome many had foreseen for years, but at the uncanny accuracy with which it mirrored the very timeline and conditions French economists had been warning of since the 1950s. The records from the Bank for International Settlements provide the damning evidence. In the days that followed Nixon's decree, the global monetary system descended into the exact chaos Rueff had prophesied. Unmoored from the discipline of gold, currency values began to convulse violently. The illusion of stability forged at Bretton Woods evaporated overnight, replaced by the very vortex of floating rate uncertainty that Rueff had long insisted was the system's inescapable destiny. The British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Anthony Barber, articulated the profound sense of European betrayal. For years, American officials had dismissed their concerns about the dollar as baseless paranoia. With this one act, they confirmed that those fears were not just justified, but understated. The very allies once condescendingly brushed aside as envious were now unmasked as the only clear-eyed observers of the impending disaster. What is truly damning are the administration's own private communications, unearthed years later, revealing a chilling internal consensus. They knew they were enacting the precise scenario Rueff had detailed. They were fully aware they were vindicating the French economist, but the calculus of political survival rendered a public admission unthinkable. The grim irony, however, did not end with the suspension. In the chaotic months after August 15th, as Nixon's team scrambled to forge a new monetary order, they found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of problems, every single one of which Rueff had explicitly linked to the dangers of unanchored currencies and floating exchange rates. Freed from the constraints of gold, inflation began its insidious creep. Trade deficits ballooned, and a chronic, debilitating instability became the new normal in global economics. By December of 1971, a desperate attempt to patch the hemorrhaging system, the Smithsonian Agreement, was cobbled together with new fixed exchange rates. But it was already painfully obvious these were mere bandages on the system that had been irrevocably broken. The gold standard, the bedrock of international finance for centuries, was gone. In its place stood the very thing Rueff had warned against: a discretionary system destined to breed chronic instability and relentless inflation. And perhaps the most unsettling fact of all, Jacques Rueff, then in his 70s, lived long enough to witness his 1944 prophecy fulfilled, with cold, mathematical precision. The collapse occurred just as he had calculated, on the timeline he had projected, and through the very mechanism he had diagnosed as structurally inevitable. For 27 years, America had willfully ignored the warning, dismissing the Cassandra from France as a relic driven by European envy. But the unforgiving logic of mathematics is immune to political rhetoric and national pride. The doomsday clock that Jacques Rueff had set in 1944 had finally, inexorably, ticked down to zero. The ensuing fallout would warp the global economy for the next 50 years. Yet the most chilling revelation is this: we were on the verge of repeating the exact same catastrophic error. This is the fact that should haunt every American. We are now living inside Jacques Rueff's second prophecy, and our leaders are deploying the same failed playbook of denial and dismissal that proved so disastrous in 1971. The destructive mathematics that shattered Bretton Woods never vanished. They have merely mutated into a new, more virulent form. The gold standard's promise has been replaced by a far more fragile vow: to honor a currency backed by nothing but blind faith in a government's ability to manage an unmanageable debt. We have merely swapped one equation of collapse for another, and the ominous ticking of the clock has resumed. Consider the chilling reality of our situation. The United States now sustains a global military footprint of over 750 bases, projecting its influence across every continent while clinging to its status as the world's reserve currency. This entire apparatus is financed by the very mechanism Jacques Rueff diagnosed as fatally flawed 80 years prior. We flood the world with liquidity by incurring staggering, self-destructive deficits. This process generates dollars far beyond what our productive economy can justify, causing our national debt to detonate to a catastrophic $33 trillion. This figure is so vast it eclipses our total annual economic output by more than 120%. And an analysis of the Congressional Budget Office's own projections reveals an even darker future. We are accumulating over $1 trillion in new debt annually, with no rational, mathematical path to repayment through conventional means. This is the precise nightmare Jacques Rueff foretold, manifesting in our time. A system of boundless currency creation anchored only by hollow promises we are incapable of honoring. The historical parallels to the 1960s are not just stunning, they are deeply terrifying. Just as foreign nations began to lose faith in the dollar's convertibility, when our gold reserves proved insufficient for our global ambitions, so too are today's emerging powers scrutinizing whether America's colossal debt can sustain the dollar's global dominance. The BRICS nations, China, Russia, India, and Brazil, are methodically divesting from dollar reserves and constructing parallel financial architectures. What is critically alarming is the official response from Washington, the same dismissive, arrogant rhetoric that catastrophically failed in 1971. When Beijing publicizes its new gold acquisitions or forges bilateral trade pacts that circumvent the dollar, our own Treasury Department denounces it as economic nationalism, willfully ignoring the supposed benefits of dollar stability. When Russia and Iran engineer payment systems to operate beyond the SWIFT network's reach, we label them as mere authoritarian schemes to disrupt the international order. Does this echo of history sound familiar? It is the identical playbook used to discredit Jacques Rueff and Charles de Gaulle. The strategy is simple. Marginalize the critics as envious rivals, ignorant of the complex realities of modern financial systems. Yet, the cold, unforgiving arithmetic is the same today as it was in 1944. An analysis of the Federal Reserve's own data reveals that our money supply has expanded by over 400% since the year 2000. During that same period, our real productive capacity has struggled to grow by a mere 50%. We are printing currency at a rate that far outpaces our creation of tangible wealth. This is precisely the type of reckless monetary expansion that Rueff predicted would inevitably shatter confidence in any currency. The system's warning indicators are now flashing critical red across the board. The price of gold has skyrocketed from $300 an ounce in 2000 to over $2,000 today, a clear market signal pricing in the very currency debasement Rueff forecasted as the consequence of abandoning gold. Globally, central banks are now hoarding gold at a velocity not seen since the 1960s, the exact period they were bracing for the implosion of the Bretton Woods system. And perhaps the most ominous sign of all is the rise of central bank digital currencies and alternative reserve assets, which directly mirror the challenge France leveled against dollar supremacy in the 1960s. Consider China's digital yuan, the European Union's strategic push to lessen its reliance on the dollar, and the mounting chorus demanding the new global monetary framework, all echoing the fundamental warnings Rueff issued about America's monetary entitlement. But the most incomprehensible dimension to this crisis is this. We possess 80 years of irrefutable historical evidence proving that ignoring these signals culminates in catastrophic monetary collapse. And yet, our leadership is repeating the exact same errors. Officials at the Federal Reserve casually dismiss legitimate concerns over debt sustainability as mere political talking points. Secretaries of the Treasury proclaim the dollar's dominance is immutable, citing America's economic might as an eternal guarantee. Defense officials contend that our global military projection is non-negotiable for stability, irrespective of the fiscal black hole required to fund it. It is 1965 repeating itself, with Janet Yellen now cast in the role of Henry Fowler, insisting that all fundamental indicators are sound, even as the mathematical contradictions of the system spiral into undeniable crisis. We are now even co-opting the precise language of our critics, referring to dollar dominance as an exorbitant privilege, the very term Charles de Gaulle used to condemn the system's inherent inequity. The final, bitter irony is that contemporary American economists are now rediscovering the very insights into monetary systems and international finance that Jacques Rueff presented decades ago. Yet, these are presented as novel theoretical breakthroughs, not the dire prophecies we have willfully disregarded for 80 long years. The scholastic discourse on fiscal dominance and debt sustainability is nothing more than a redressing of the same stark mathematical truths Rueff laid bare in the 1950s. Consider your retirement funds, your life savings, the very financial bedrock of your children's future. all are precariously balanced on a monetary framework built upon the same flawed, impossible arithmetic that shattered the gold standard. We are financing a sprawling global apparatus through relentless deficit spending, fabricating currency at a rate that catastrophically outpaces the creation of actual wealth, while branding dissenters as relics of a bygone era, blind to the complexities of our time. But the prescient warning from Jacques Rueff transcended the mere collapse of Bretton Woods. It was a fundamental indictment of any monetary system predicated on the delusion of infinite expansion upon a foundation of finite resources. It matters not if the promise is gold convertibility or the illusion of debt sustainability. The cold, unforgiving logic of mathematics will inevitably overtake the fiction of the promises. The clock that began its ominous countdown in 1944 was not halted in 1971. It was merely reset, wound to a new series of unachievable guarantees. We turned a deaf ear to the alarm when our vaults held 20,000 tons of gold. We dismissed the prophecy when our industrial might was unparalleled on the world stage. And we continue to ignore it now, buried under $33 trillion of debt, as the global economic order increasingly scrutinizes our capacity to fulfill our obligations. Jacques Rueff delivered an 80-year premonition to America. We were deaf to it in 1944. We were blind to it in 1971. We remain willfully ignorant today. The underlying mathematics are immutable. Only the fuse has grown dangerously shorter. The critical inquiry is not if this fragile system will implode in the same manner as Bretton Woods did. The question is whether we will at last heed the alarm, or if we will squander the next decade silencing the dissenters, right up to the calamitous moment we are forced to concede the French economist's grim accuracy. History may not replicate itself, but its echoes are undeniable. And in this very moment, those echoes resonate with the rhythm of a doomsday clock that has been ticking relentlessly for 80 years.